We step into a world shrouded in secrecy and pain, a world where women face a terrifying choice: the risk of death in childbirth or the risk of death from the very methods they use to prevent it. Imagine being so desperate to control your own body that you would willingly drink mercury, insert sharpened shards of copper into your womb, or consume herbs that could stop your heart. This wasn't the plot of a horror story. For over 1,000 years, this was a grim reality for women in medieval Europe. We will uncover the shocking truths about medieval contraception, a story of incredible courage, chilling desperation, and dangerous knowledge passed down in whispers. What you are about to hear will change how you see not only history, but also the fundamental rights we often take for granted today. If you're settling in for tonight's journey into the past, I invite you to become part of our community of historical explorers. If this story resonates with you, a simple click on the subscribe and like buttons helps this channel grow and bring more hidden histories to light. I'm always curious to know where these stories find you. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom, a quiet living room, or perhaps during a late-night walk? Drop a comment below and let me know. I genuinely love hearing where in the world you are. Dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back nearly 8 centuries to uncover a shocking and vital part of our shared history together. The impossible choice. The year is 1347. You are a 25-year-old woman named Eleonora living in a small, damp cottage in an English village. You already have 4 young children, their faces thin and their clothes patched. Winter is a looming threat, its icy breath already felt in the morning air. Your family barely has enough grain stored to survive the coming months, and another mouth to feed could mean starvation for everyone. But here is your terrifying reality. You have absolutely no safe option. The local wise woman, a figure both feared and revered, whispers a concoction made from mercury and wine, the same liquid silver that would slowly poison your organs and unravel your mind. There is talk among the village women of inserting sharpened pieces of copper into womb, a crude and agonizing procedure that killed more women than childbirth itself. Or perhaps you consider the gentler option of consuming massive doses of herbs like tansy or pennyroyal, plants so toxic they could overwhelm your liver and stop your heart in minutes. This wasn't a matter of primitive ignorance. Medieval women were not stupid, and their desperation, born from a brutal reality, led them to embrace methods that modern medicine would classify as attempted suicide. Let me paint you a clearer picture of just how dangerous medieval life was for women. Historical records meticulously pieced together from 14th century England show that nearly 1 in 3 women died from pregnancy-related complications. To put that in modern terms, that's roughly 300 deaths for every 1,000 births. Modern America sees about 17 deaths per 100,000 births. Imagine those odds for a moment. Every single time a medieval woman became pregnant, she was essentially playing Russian roulette with her life, with a bullet in the chamber 1 out of every 3 times. But here's what makes this even more heartbreaking. These women were acutely aware of the risks. They weren't ignorant of the dangers of childbirth. Medieval midwives, though lacking scientific knowledge, kept detailed experiential records, and in the tight-knit world of medieval village, word traveled fast when another woman died in labor. Women watched their own mothers, their sisters, and their neighbors die regularly from complications like hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labor, conditions we can easily treat today. When faced with a very real and immediate possibility of the alternative methods, no matter how dangerous they seemed, became reasonable gambles. It's a twisted logic born of desperation. When you're staring down a 30% chance of dying from a natural process, drinking poison might not seem so crazy after all. The most sought-after contraceptive of the ancient and early medieval period was a plant called silphium. It was so effective and so desperately desired that it literally went extinct from overuse. This wasn't some minor folk remedy. It was serious business. The Romans valued silphium so highly that it was worth more than its weight in gold. Archaeological evidence and surviving trade records show that silphium was often traded for silver denarii at a rate that would make it worth approximately $5,000 per ounce in today's money. But here's the catch, and this is where the story of medieval contraception gets truly terrifying. Silphium likely worked precisely because it was incredibly toxic. The plant contained potent compounds that would essentially poison a woman's reproductive system into temporary sterility. Users described experiencing severe cramping, heavy bleeding, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of organ distress. Many women who use silphium regularly likely developed what medieval physicians called the wasting sickness, probably chronic kidney and liver damage. By the 1st century AD, Silphium had been harvested to extinction. But the demand for effective birth control didn't disappear with the plant. Instead, medieval women, deprived of their most reliable option, turned to increasingly dangerous alternatives, each one more horrifying than the last. The alchemist's promise and the herbalist's gamble. With silphium gone, women turned to the shimmering, seductive promise of alchemy. Mercury, the liquid silver that fascinated and obsessed medieval minds, became the poor woman's silphium. Transformative properties. Its liquid, mirror-like appearance convinced many that it could reflect pregnancy away from the body. Women would mix a few drops of mercury with wine or honey and drink it in small doses over several days. What they couldn't possibly know was that mercury is one of the most potent neurotoxins on Earth. It doesn't just prevent pregnancy. It accumulates in the body, destroying the nervous system, causing kidney failure, and leading to a condition of unimaginable suffering. Historical accounts from medieval hospitals describe women arriving with symptoms that we now instantly recognize as mercury poisoning: violent, uncontrollable tremors, the loss of teeth and hair, and what physicians of the time chillingly called the silver madness, a condition where patients would laugh hysterically and uncontrollably while their organs slowly shut down. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of early medieval birth control wasn't the danger of the methods themselves, but how normalized they had become. These weren't desperate last resorts used only in extreme circumstances. They were regular practices, passed down from mothers to daughters, recommended by village healers, and even endorsed by some of the most respected medieval physicians. In 13th century France, medical texts provided detailed instructions for preparing mercury-based contraceptives. One of the most influential medieval medical manuscripts on women's health contained recipes for birth control that included not just mercury, but also lead, arsenic, and other substances we now know are deadly poisons. Written sometime in the 12th century, matter-of-factly instructs women to drink the juice of the herb tansy mixed with wine, or to insert a suppository made from copper and honey, as if these were perfectly reasonable medical treatments. The casual, clinical tone of these instructions reveals just how deeply accepted these dangerous practices were. What's particularly heartbreaking is that these methods sometimes worked, but not because they were safe or effective contraceptives. They worked because they were so toxic they would poison a woman's entire reproductive system into submission. A woman who survived chronic mercury poisoning might indeed avoid pregnancy for months or even years, but only because her body was too damaged and sick to conceive. This creates a tragic irony. The success stories of medieval contraception were actually stories of survival against impossible odds. When a woman boasted that her mercury treatments had kept her from conceiving for 2 years, what she was really saying was that she had somehow managed not to die from chronic heavy metal poisoning. The social pressure that drove women to these extremes was immense. A woman's worth was often measured by her ability to produce healthy male heirs for her husband's lineage. But too many pregnancies, one after another without respite, could literally kill her. It was an impossible situation. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Wealthy women had slightly better, though still dangerous. They could afford to purchase rare, imported herbs or pay for the services of experienced physicians who might know marginally safer methods. But for the vast majority of medieval women, the peasants, the servants, the wives, the craftsmen, the choice was between risking death from pregnancy or risking death from a cure. And here's what makes this story even more compelling. These women were not passive victims. They were pioneers, desperate experimenters, and quiet rebels fighting against a system that gave them no good choices. They shared information in secret, passed down recipes through generations, and risked their lives in pursuit of a concept that wouldn't even have a name for centuries: reproductive autonomy. In many ways, these women, with their toxic herbs and dangerous metals, were the earliest reproductive rights activists. They may not have had modern medicine or legal protections, but they had courage, determination, and an unshakable belief that they deserved some control over their own bodies and futures. The impossible virtue, religion, and reproduction. What drove Eleanor and millions of women like her to such desperate measures? The answer lies not just in medicine, but in a crushing combination of demographics, economics, and religion that created a perfect storm of suffering. Here's a number that will haunt you. In 14th century Europe, the average woman gave birth to 7 children during her lifetime. But here's the truly devastating part. Only 3 of those children would survive to adulthood. And for the mothers themselves, the risk was constant. Imagine being pregnant or nursing for nearly your entire adult life, knowing that each pregnancy brought that same terrifying 1 in 3 chance of death. It's like playing Russian roulette over and over again, except the chamber keeps getting loaded with more bullets. And medieval women weren't just worried about their own deaths. They knew that if they died in childbirth, their existing children would likely die, too. In an era before social safety nets, orphan children had a mortality rate of nearly 80% within their first year of losing their mother. When Eleanor stood in her small cottage that winter night, staring at her 4 hungry children, she was doing a horrific kind of mathematics that no mother should ever have to perform. Is it better to risk my life preventing another pregnancy, or risk all of our lives by having another child we can't feed? The economic reality was brutal. The average peasant family lived just 3 meals away from starvation. A family of 6 might have enough grain stored to last through winter, but a family of 7 could mean death for everyone. The phrase, too many mouths to feed, wasn't just an expression. It was a literal death sentence. But here's where the story takes an even darker, more twisted turn. The Catholic Church, which dominated every aspect of medieval life, had created a perfect storm of impossible expectations for women. The church taught that a woman's highest calling was motherhood. Having children was not just expected, it was considered a holy duty. Yet, this same society provided no support systems for women who couldn't handle unlimited pregnancies. There were no government assistance programs, no widespread medical care for complicated births, no adoption services for unwanted children. Women were expected to keep having babies until their bodies gave out, and if they couldn't handle it, that was seen as a personal moral failing. The church's position on contraception was crystal clear and absolutely inflexible. The influential 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively on the subject, declaring that any attempt to prevent conception was an act and therefore against God. The punishment for using contraception was excommunication, which in medieval times meant not just spiritual damnation, but complete social and economic exile. Here's a fascinating contradiction that reveals just how desperate women were. Even the threat of eternal damnation couldn't stop them from seeking birth control. Church records from across medieval Europe are filled with confessions from women who admitted to using contraceptive methods. The archives of the Spanish Inquisition contain hundreds of testimonies from women who confessed to using everything from herbal potions to primitive barrier methods. These were deeply religious women who genuinely believed they might go to hell for their actions, yet they still chose to risk eternal damnation rather than face another potentially fatal pregnancy. The village wise women, the healers and midwives who often possessed the most practical knowledge about contraception, lived in constant fear. They walked a dangerous tightrope between helping desperate women and avoiding accusations of witchcraft. Because here's something that's absolutely chilling. Knowledge about birth control was often considered evidence of supernatural evil. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, specifically listed knowledge of contraceptive methods as a primary sign of witchcraft. Used throughout Europe to identify and prosecute suspected witches, stated that women who could prevent pregnancy must have made pacts with demons. The logic was terrifyingly simple. Only evil, supernatural powers could interfere with God's plan for reproduction. This meant that the women most qualified to help, experienced midwives and herbalists, were also the most likely to be burned at the stake. Despite all these dangers, the demand was so high that an entire underground economy developed around birth control knowledge. In medieval Paris, there was a black market for contraceptive information. Women would pay substantial sums, sometimes equivalent to a month's wages, for recipes and instructions. They created elaborate systems of code words and secret meetings to share information, developing a vocabulary of euphemisms, restoring monthly regularity, ensuring feminine health, maintaining bodily balance that allowed them to discuss contraception without directly admitting to it. The courage this required is almost impossible to comprehend. The twisted logic of the church. Now, here's where this story takes a truly twisted turn. The very institution that condemned women for seeking birth control was simultaneously creating conditions that made it absolutely necessary. The Catholic Church didn't just oppose contraception. It created a web of contradictions so complex and dangerous that it literally drove women to their deaths. The Church's official position wasn't just, don't use birth control. It was far more insidious. Pope Innocent III, in his 1215 decree, established what became known as the conjugal debt doctrine. This wasn't just theological theory. It was practical law that governed every Christian marriage. According to this doctrine, Married couples were required to have sexual relations whenever either partner requested it. For a wife to refuse her husband was considered a mortal sin, punishable by severe penance and social condemnation. Here's the impossible situation for women. They were required to be sexually available to their husbands at all times, forbidden from using any form of birth control, yet somehow expected to survive unlimited pregnancies in an era with no effective medical care. It gets even more absurd. The same church that demanded unlimited sexual availability also declared that enjoying marital relations was sinful. The message was clear. A woman must be sexually available but never enjoy it, must conceive regularly but never try to prevent it, and must risk death in childbirth while maintaining spiritual purity. This created what historians now call impossible virtue, a standard so contradictory that no medieval woman could possibly achieve it. And when women inevitably failed, the church blamed them for their moral weakness. The theological justification for this madness came from the church's interpretation of original sin. According to medieval doctrine, women bore a special responsibility for humanity's fall from grace. This belief had devastating practical consequences. The influential theologian Albertus Magnus argued that women were essentially defective men whose primary purpose was reproduction. Used in universities across Europe, claimed that women who avoided pregnancy were violating their fundamental nature. But here's where the hypocrisy becomes truly staggering. While condemning ordinary women for seeking birth control, the church quietly developed its own methods for controlling reproduction among the clergy. Vatican archives, made accessible to researchers only in the 20th century, revealed correspondence between popes and monasteries regarding what was euphemistically called maintaining clerical discipline. These letters contained detailed instructions for preparing herbal mixtures that would diminish carnal desires and prevent the unfortunate consequences of clerical relationships. The recipes are almost identical to the contraceptive formulas that the church was simultaneously condemning. The main difference? When priests used pennyroyal and tansy to prevent pregnancies among their secret partners, maintaining spiritual purity. When ordinary women used the exact same herbs to save their own lives, it was called consorting with demons. This double standard was a form of institutional gaslighting that kept women compliant even as the system literally worked them to death. The herbal arsenal, medicine or poison, driven to desperation, medieval women turned to the plant kingdom for salvation. And what they found, it was both miraculous and absolutely terrifying. Welcome to the world of herbal contraception, where the line between medicine and poison was so thin it might as well have been invisible. In 1973, archaeologists excavating a medieval pharmacy in Canterbury, England, found something extraordinary hidden beneath the floorboards. Over 200 clay vessels containing dried herbs, each carefully labeled with cryptic symbols. When researchers finally decoded these symbols, they realized they had stumbled upon the largest collection of medieval contraceptive recipes ever discovered. But here's what made this find absolutely chilling. Chemical analysis revealed that every single one of these remedies contained compounds that modern toxicology classifies as potentially lethal. We're not talking about mild side effects. We're talking about plants so dangerous that a slightly miscalculated dose could stop your heart, destroy your liver, or cause you to hemorrhage to death. The most popular herb in these collections was tansy, an innocent-looking yellow flower. Medieval women believed it was a gift from God to help them control their fertility. What they didn't know was that tansy contains a potent neurotoxin called thujone, the same chemical that makes traditional absinthe so dangerous. Women would brew tansy tea so strong it could literally cause seizures, organ failure, and death. But here's the truly heartbreaking part. Tansy actually worked as a contraceptive, which is precisely why women kept using it despite the horrific side effects. The plant's toxic compounds would prevent the implantation of a fertilized egg by essentially poisoning the uterine lining. The Canterbury Pharmacy collection contained detailed dosage instructions. When modern pharmacologists analyzed these recipes, they discovered that the safe doses recommended by medieval herbalists were often just barely below lethal levels. The difference between preventing a pregnancy and dying was literally a few dried leaves. Tansy was just the beginning, a member of the mint family that smells deceptively pleasant but contains pulgone, a compound so toxic to the liver and kidneys that it's now banned for human consumption. And there was Queen Anne's lace wild carrot, whose seeds contain compounds that interfere with progesterone production. However, they also contain photosensitizing compounds that make the skin incredibly vulnerable to the sun, severe chemical burns. Medieval physicians called it the spotted curse. These herbs were often combined into multi-herb cocktails that created unpredictable and deadly chemical interactions. Modern toxicologists who have studied these recipes have described them as biochemical Russian roulette. Despite the horrific death toll, some of these herbal methods were remarkably effective. The problem wasn't that medieval women were ignorant. It was that they were performing advanced biochemistry experiments on themselves using some of the most toxic plants on Earth, without any understanding of proper dosage or safety protocols. Physical barriers and crude interventions. When women realized that drinking poison wasn't a sustainable long-term strategy, they turned what seemed like a more practical approach, creating physical barriers to prevent conception. What they came up with was so bizarre, so dangerous, and so absolutely desperate that it makes modern contraception look like a miracle of human ingenuity. The most common DIY contraceptive device was a wool shield. Women would take raw, unprocessed sheep's wool, sometimes mixed with honey or vinegar as a spermicide, and insert it as deeply as possible into their vaginas before intercourse. But this was raw fleece, often still containing dirt, feces, and bacteria. Medical records from the period are filled with entries describing wool fever, severe infections caused by these contaminated wool pessaries. Archaeological excavations of medieval privies have revealed an astonishing array of other objects used as contraceptives: pieces of leather, wads of cloth, and even carved wooden plugs. These plugs, shaped roughly like modern menstrual cups, were designed to cover the cervix. But the rough hewn would cause microscopic tears in vaginal tissue, creating perfect entry points for life-threatening infections. Perhaps the most surprising barrier method was the use of animal intestines as primitive condoms. These were made from sheep or pig intestines that had been cleaned, and I use that term very loosely, and tied at one end. The process was revolting, and the resulting sheaths were fragile and expensive. This meant they were often washed and reused multiple times, creating a perfect vector for spreading sexually transmitted infections. Some women turned to metal objects, creating primitive IUDs from copper, bronze, or even iron. Archaeologists have found female skeletons with small copper spirals still lodged in their pelvic cavities. Medieval women had stumbled onto an effective contraceptive principle centuries before medical science would, but they were using it in ways that turned medicine into torture. Some medical texts even describe heating copper objects until they glowed red-hot before insertion, believing the heat would purify the womb. The pain and trauma must have been unimaginable. Darkest choices. When all of these methods failed, when the herbs poisoned, the mercury drove them mad, and the physical barriers caused fatal infections, some medieval women faced the most horrifying choice imaginable. They turned to what historians euphemistically call post-birth family planning, but what we must honestly acknowledge as one of the darkest chapters in human reproductive history, infanticide as the ultimate form of birth control. I need to warn you that what we're about to discuss is deeply disturbing, but it's a crucial part of understanding just how desperate medieval women became. It wasn't random violence. In many communities, it was a systematic practice with its own customs and justifications. Archaeological studies of medieval cemeteries consistently show infant mortality rates that cannot be explained by natural causes alone. Dr. Rebecca Gowland's groundbreaking analysis of over 50 medieval burial sites revealed that up to 30% of infant deaths showed signs of deliberate intervention. Records from medieval foundling hospitals, like the Hospital Santo Spirito in Rome, show thousands of abandoned infants, many delivered already dying from what was called preparation for departure, meaning they were deliberately weakened or poisoned before being left. Medieval midwifery manuals contain instructions for easing the passage of unwanted infants, birth techniques designed to cause oxygen deprivation or other fatal complications. The text framed this as an act of mercy, a way to release the soul immediately than to watch it suffer slow destruction. This was reinforced by theological debates about soul delay, the idea that a soul didn't fully enter a body until baptism, creating a moral gray area. The gender dynamics were also stark. Female infants were far more likely to be victims of infanticide than male infants, reflecting the grim economic calculation of a society that valued sons over daughters. When even this seemed too unbearable, some women turned to the final frontier of reproductive desperation, abortion methods so primitive and brutal, they represent some of the most horrifying medical practices in history. Excavations at the Hôtel Dieu in Paris uncovered a hidden chamber containing a medieval abortion toolkit. Over 200 instruments, including sharpened sticks, metal hooks, and caustic chemicals, used continuously for 3 centuries. Women would perform these procedures on themselves or with the help of other untrained women, using sharpened pieces of wood to puncture the amniotic sac or heated iron rods to encourage the womb to release its burden. The pain was unimaginable, the risk of infection and hemorrhage was astronomical, and the mortality rate was estimated to be over 50%. Attempting an abortion was essentially a coin flip between ending the pregnancy and ending the woman's life, the end of a nightmare and its lessons. So why did these horrifying practices persist for so long? It was a perfect storm of psychological bias, the belief that it won't happen to me, the complete lack of safer alternatives, crushing economic pressure, and deep-seated religious and social control. The end of this nightmare began not with single medical breakthrough, but with the slow, creeping changes of the Renaissance. As Italian city-states grew wealthy, families could finally afford another child, and the desperate mathematics of survival began to change. The printing press allowed safer, albeit still coded, medical knowledge to spread, and the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman medical texts brought more sophisticated ideas about reproduction back into European thought. But perhaps the most profound lesson from this dark history is about the extraordinary courage and resilience of women facing impossible circumstances. Eleanora and millions like her were not passive victims. They were pioneers and survivors who did whatever it took to navigate a world that offered them no good options. Their story is a chilling reminder of what happens when societies deny women safe reproductive choices. The desperation, the danger, and the suffering are not confined to the distant past. Where safe contraception is unavailable or restricted, women still resort to dangerous methods. The legacy of these medieval women lives on in every modern person who has access to safe, effective contraception. Their freedoms were not gifts. They were won through centuries of struggle, sacrifice, and the quiet determination of women who refused to accept that controlling their own bodies had to be a death sentence. Think about modern reproductive rights. Remember Eleanora, standing in her cold cottage, facing choices no human should ever have to make. Remember the thousands who died from poison and crude surgery because they valued their autonomy more than their own safety. And remember that the freedoms we enjoy today are not permanent. They exist because people in every generation choose to protect them. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but important journey. I know these stories were hard to hear, but understanding this history is crucial for appreciating the progress we've made and for protecting the rights we sometimes take for granted. The human story is filled with darkness and light, and tonight we have looked into some of the deepest shadows. But in doing so, we have also found a story of incredible strength and the unyielding human desire for self-determination. And I'll see you next time for another exploration into the fascinating, complex, and often surprising world of our past.